Great. Good to see everybody. I want to give some time for people to flow into the session in case they're running a little bit behind. But in the meantime, I'll just go over our normal procedure, what we call like our housekeeping. So for those who are new here, our webinars are always recorded. So if you happen to miss any parts or you have a colleague that wanted to, you'll always be able to access the recording through the email that you registered. And we also upload all of our content on our YouTube channel at the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. So if you haven't subscribed yet, I encourage you to do so. Again, we upload all our content for homeless veterans on YouTube. So 45 minutes of presentation and about 15 minutes of Q&A. So as you have a question, feel free to put your question in. We'll return back to it during that 15-minute session. One thing I want to point out is that there are two separate tabs. There's a chat tab and then there's a questions tab. If you have a question or a comment, I strongly encourage you guys to simply use and exclusively use the questions tab throughout the webinar. Chat's disabled. So if you do have anything that you want to ask your presenters or any comments that you want to flag, just be sure to use that questions tab. So to do a little bit of practice for our attendees, I would like for you all to introduce yourself, tell us your name, position within your organization. All right, so while you guys are doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and get our webinar started. So this is our second webinar of 4 for 2024. For those who aren't aware, we started this project back in 2021, thanks to the generous support of the Home Depot Foundation. At the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, or NCHV for short, our goal is to put an end to veteran homelessness, and we do so by sharing best practices, working in the policy space, as well as connecting providers and people at risk of experiencing homelessness with helpful resources. So our focus for this series is really to elevate the voices of homeless veterans. And today's webinar is on organizing nonpartisan candidate forums. So if you're unfamiliar with candidate forums, they're community events to bridge constituencies and prospective leaders together to discuss critical issues. It's a really powerful tool for learning about candidates before constituents go to the polls, educating them about what leaders are planning to do about the issues their communities care for, or communities care about the most. And each election year always presents new opportunities to take another step in advancing our goals to end veteran homelessness. As we've seen in just this year alone, we've seen the stakes grow as housing costs increase, supply dwindles, and the push to criminalize homelessness spreads. So we need everyone working together to use their voices and influence to create a safe future for those struggling with homelessness. Now, housing and homelessness are two incredibly complex subjects to talk about. Constituents and lawmakers alike might not fully be informed on these topics. There are many housing-related issues determined at the state and local level, especially related to the distribution of funding, zoning issues, building codes, and other issues that can affect our ability to create enough affordable housing. That said, nonprofits engaging with candidates and constituencies can make a remarkable difference in their role to get voters thinking. But nonprofit 501c3 organizations, which our audience typically come from, must remain nonpartisan and can't formally involve themselves in the political process. But they can play an active role in educating those voters, prospective and current leadership through hosting the candidate forums and leveraging other resources to share crucial information about the issues regarding homelessness. So in this webinar, we'll discuss how providers can plan and execute candidate forums, as well as create a foundation of advocacy to ensure that voters are thinking about homelessness when they're at the polls. So today, our presentation includes Courtney Cooperman, the project manager of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's Our Homes, Our Votes campaign. Courtney empowers the housing and homelessness sector to educate, register, and mobilize low-income voters in their communities, and to elevate housing as an election issue. Prior to this role, Courtney served as a housing advocacy organizer at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and a legislative assistant at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, the social justice arm of the Reform Jewish movement. Courtney holds a BA in political science from Stanford University, where she completed an interdisciplinary honors thesis on the relationship between homelessness and political inequality. And recently, Courtney earned an MA in public policy from George Washington University. Excuse me. Next, we'll hear from James Durrah, Chief Communications Officer at Miriam's Kitchen. James is a skilled strategic communications, brand development, and digital media professional who successfully developed media relations and digital marketing strategy in support of a diverse list of brands that cover numerous industries. His communications and marketing strategy has supported multiple nonprofit institutional development initiatives, including both local and national multi-million dollar fundraising campaigns. James's experience also extends to account management within agency settings, managing the brands of Fortune 500 companies and national nonprofit organizations. Thank you both for participating in this webinar. I'll leave it to you. Courtney, you have the floor. I'm going to shut up, and I'll see you guys for Q&A.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Jay, for the introduction. It's really an honor to be on here today to speak to you all about nonpartisan candidate forums and candidate engagement for homelessness and housing organizations. Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. We can go on to the next slide. So just kind of an overview of what I'll be speaking about today. I'll start with some background information about the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign, why homelessness and housing organizations should really care about nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement in the first place. And I'll include some of the ways that Our Homes, Our Votes has engaged candidates to move the needle on housing policy. I'll give a very brief overview of some legal considerations for 501c3s to keep this candidate engagement work strictly nonpartisan. Then I'll get into the various types of candidate engagement opportunities and best practices for planning a candidate forum, which I know James will elaborate upon further. And then I'll conclude with some resources that Our Homes, Our Votes makes available to support candidate engagement and nonpartisan election work more broadly. And we can go to the next slide. So I'll start by just zooming out to this bigger picture, why nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement matters. Why is this something that we care about at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and why should you and your organization care? We can go to the next slide. For anyone who's not familiar with us, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, or NLIHC, is a policy and advocacy organization dedicated to achieving racially and socially equitable public policy that ensures renters with the lowest incomes have quality, accessible, and affordable homes in communities of their choice. 2024 is our 50th anniversary, and we're certainly very proud of all of the progress we've made in this mission. But we also recognize that our ability to achieve policy change is limited unless elected officials see themselves as accountable to low-income renters and people experiencing homelessness. And the way to do that is by boosting voter turnout within these communities. And we can go to the next slide. That's why we launched the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign, which is our nonpartisan initiative to boost voter turnout among low-income people and to elevate housing as an election issue. The campaign empowers advocates, tenant leaders, housing providers, and direct services organizations to register, educate, and mobilize voters in their communities and to engage with candidates. We know, again, that all of you on this call are extremely busy and resources are always stretched thin, so this might seem like a lot to take on, but that's why we launched Our Homes, Our Votes. Our goal is really to increase the capacity of the housing and homelessness sector to do nonpartisan election work without ever reinventing the wheel. But again, we can go to the next slide. Why? Oh, we're on the right slide. Never mind. Why does this matter? Why should it be a priority to do this work? The connections between housing justice and democratic participation are clear. Just like housing, voting is a social determinant of health, and the American Medical Association has actually declared it as such. Research shows that civically engaged communities are healthier communities. We can go to the next slide. On the flip side, housing instability can undermine access to the democratic process. Research from Eviction Lab shows that in the 2016 elections, communities that saw increases in eviction rates also saw declines in voter turnout. We can go to the next slide. The same communities that face the greatest barriers to securing stable, accessible, affordable homes also face the greatest barriers to voting. Low-income people, especially those facing housing insecurity, face structural barriers that make it more challenging for them to vote. Less flexible work schedules, childcare needs, limited transportation options, and in some states, restrictive voter ID laws are among the many obstacles that disproportionately prevent low-income people from voting. Renters are also more likely to move between elections than homeowners. Whenever someone changes their address, they need to update their voter registration. But that process isn't always made clear or accessible. And while voters experiencing homelessness absolutely have the legal right to vote, this process of registering and voting without a permanent address is not always made clear or accessible. On top of all of these very concrete obstacles, low-income people and those who have historically been disenfranchised can be very justifiably skeptical that voting is worth their time, since they've seen elected officials fail to keep their promises year after year. Coupled with deliberate voter suppression tactics that target people of color, who are disproportionately low-income renters and disproportionately experience homelessness due to structural racism in the housing market, these factors are all contributing to really stark voter turnout disparities between renters and homeowners, and between low-income and high-income people. In the 2022 midterms, just 37% of renters voted, compared to 58% of homeowners. One-third of the lowest income people voted, compared to two-thirds of the highest income people. These striking disparities are, in my mind, the key to understanding why elected officials don't prioritize housing policies that meet the needs of the lowest income renters. Elected officials, like all of us, want to keep their jobs, so they're most incentivized to listen to their constituents that vote at the highest rates, which are high-income people and homeowners who are disproportionately white. Voter turnout disparities then create this self-reinforcing cycle, where policies don't meet the needs of the lowest income people, who in turn face continued obstacles to achieving housing stability and to voting. So that's all very bleak, but I'm an optimistic person. And fortunately, the people in this virtual room have the power to break this cycle. I really do believe that. And we can go to the next slide. New research from Nonprofit Vote shows that voters who were engaged by nonprofits in 2022 turned out to vote at a rate 10 percentage points higher than voters who were not engaged by nonprofits. Among people of color, that boost rises to 12 percentage points. We can go to the next slide. And among low-income people, that boost rises to 15 percentage points. So it's very clear that nonprofits who have deep relationships and trust with low-income people have the power to increase voter turnout in their communities. Tenant and community leaders who are deeply rooted in their neighborhoods are also among the most powerful trusted messengers who can convey information about voting to their peers, clear up misconceptions, and empower their community members to get out to the polls. We can go to the next slide. Election season also creates a really powerful opportunity to elevate housing and homelessness in the political conversation and push elected officials to prioritize proven solutions. And that's really the focus of our conversation today. I'll highlight three main reasons to engage with candidates during election season. 1, bringing housing and homelessness into the spotlight. 2, laying the groundwork for effective advocacy. And 3, building voter knowledge and enthusiasm. We can go to the next slide. First, bringing housing and homelessness into the spotlight. What candidates do and say on the campaign trail is going to get media attention. If you have candidates talking about housing solutions, that means you have a larger than usual audience hearing about housing solutions and potentially joining your base of advocates. This is the strategy that NLIHC employed in the 2020 election cycle. There was a very crowded field of Democratic primary candidates, and we wrote a sign-on letter to the presidential debate moderators, urging them to ask a question about affordable housing. More than 1,000 organizations signed on, and it completely paid off. The debate moderators asked a question about affordable housing for the first time in the history of televised presidential debates. In this same election cycle, we saw primary candidates release the strongest affordable housing platforms that we've ever seen, really centering the needs of the lowest income people. Bringing housing to the forefront of political conversation during campaign season can also help bring it to the top of the policy agenda once elected officials take office. Which brings me to the second point, we can go to the next slide, is that candidate engagement lays a strong groundwork for advocacy. When we're doing legislative advocacy, we always tell people that our elected officials work for us. We are their bosses. So to extend this analogy, election season is kind of like our politicians' hiring process, or maybe their mid-year review if they're an incumbent. This is the moment when they most want to impress us. When candidates are on the campaign trail, this is really a moment when they have a vested interest in listening to the people who live in their city or district or state and proving that they will share our priorities in office. I know some of you might be rolling your eyes and thinking, but they can just lie. And certainly that is true. Just because an elected official makes a promise during campaign season doesn't mean they're going to keep it. But that's why voting is just a first step, and advocacy is necessary to hold candidates accountable. The more you can get them on the record during campaign season, the more effective your advocacy to hold them accountable to their promises will be. For example, if a candidate promises that they'll increase funding for vouchers, you can cite that commitment when you're pushing them to support a federal budget that expands funding for vouchers. And this advocacy is most effective if the legislator feels that the constituents who are making the ask will actually hold them accountable by voting. So if a legislator knows that an organization that supports or opposes a certain policy has the capacity to generate enthusiasm and turn out voters who agree with them about that policy, they're going to keep that in mind when deciding how to vote, more so than if they don't feel like your organization is really doing that voter turnout work. This means it's in an organization's vested interest not only to engage with candidates on the campaign trail, but also to invest in these really robust nonpartisan voter engagement programs. And I would say these two activities have a mutually reinforcing relationship. And that brings me to my next point. We can go to the next slide, which is that the best candidate engagement campaigns are also voter education and mobilization campaigns. Because of all these obstacles I mentioned before, low-income and housing insecure people are less likely to vote than high-income people and homeowners. For this reason, they're not on political campaigns' contact lists, so it's unlikely that political campaigns are even reaching out to them and asking them to vote. And I have this graphic on here from Nonprofit Vote that I think is really compelling, which shows that this exclusion creates a negative feedback loop that perpetuates low voter turnout in low-income communities. But again, it's not all doom and gloom. This is not inevitable. We can go to the next slide. Nonprofits' candidate engagement activities can break this cycle by building voter knowledge and enthusiasm. My homemade chart is not as pretty as the Nonprofit Vote chart. I apologize for that. If you have candidates showing up at events in communities that nonprofits are organizing, and they're talking about the issues that affect the community members' lives, and they're answering their questions, those community members are more likely to feel heard and to be enthusiastic about casting their ballots. Candidate questionnaires, forums, town halls, and other events can make the importance of the election more concrete for voters and motivate them to participate. Once the election is more visible in their community, they can be motivated to get involved and break that cycle that dampens political participation among low-income people. So it's what we're here to talk about today, the candidate forums. These events that are planned by the trusted organizations that do engage with these communities can then bring their constituents into the political conversation, help them become habitual voters, and incentivize elected officials to be responsive to their needs in policymaking and to campaign in their communities going forward. We can go to the next slide. So that's kind of my theoretical case for why nonpartisan candidate engagement matters. But many organizations are hesitant to do this work because they're afraid of being perceived as partisan. Fortunately, there are pretty clear guidelines for 501c3s to follow to ensure that they remain nonpartisan in all of their voter and candidate engagement work. We can go to the next slide. 501c3s, as I'm sure everyone is well aware, cannot engage in any partisan political activities, meaning they can't endorse or oppose candidates, align with a particular political party, or otherwise attempt to influence the outcome of an election. These all put the tax-exempt status at risk. What 501c3s can and should do is nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement. These are activities like registering, educating, and getting voters out to the polls, reaching out to candidates to educate them about the organization's priorities. Critically, this applies as long as they're reaching out and offering information to all candidates. This could mean sponsoring a candidate forum or town hall, as long as all candidates are invited and given an equal opportunity to speak. This could mean distributing candidate questionnaires, as long as all candidates have equal opportunity to participate. So you'll hear this theme kind of recurring, which is that nonpartisanship requires that all candidates for an elected office are treated equally in terms of opportunities to speak and effort made in extending an invitation or in sharing information. We can go to the next slide. I'll provide a recent example that makes this a little bit more concrete. We recently followed this principle very steadfastly with a set of letters that we wrote to the Democratic National Committee and Republican National Committee, urging each party to incorporate NLIHC's policy priorities in its 2024 platform. The text of each letter is identical. We sent them on the exact same day at the exact same time to people who hold the exact same role within each organization. Now, just because your outreach to multiple candidates is fully equal does not mean their responses will be equal, and that's okay. If only one candidate accepts your invite to speak at a forum, that's all right, as long as you can really demonstrate that you worked as hard as possible to invite the other candidates. Another best practice to keep in mind for candidate engagement is that you should also avoid criticizing candidate statements, although there are ways that you can respond to them in a neutral tone to add perspective or correct the record. You should never rank or rate candidates. This constitutes an endorsement. What you can do is release a legislative scorecard that compares the voting record of incumbent legislators only. But I would urge caution in doing this in an election year. A general rule of thumb is the closer you get to an election, the more cautious you need to be in anything that is kind of perceived as favoring a candidate. For example, like giving an award to a legislator who's running for office. Those things are all kind of should give some pause and consideration the closer you are to an election. A safer alternative than a scorecard is to do a candidate questionnaire that solicits all candidates' responses to a set of questions related to your organization's mission. You can then publish the candidates' responses and circulate that to your community as a form of voter education. A note of caution that I'll provide here is that you can't edit or condense their responses in any way. These really need to be presented to the public just as they were submitted in the questionnaire. We can go to the next slide. For some more detailed information about nonpartisanship, I highly recommend referring to the resources from the Alliance for Justice's Bolder Advocacy campaign or to the Our Homes, Our Votes website, our candidate engagement page. Those links are on the slide, and I believe that we'll send them out in follow-up notes from this call. We can go to the next slide. So I've covered some of the don'ts for nonpartisan candidate engagement. Let's get into the fun part, which is the do's. Candidate engagement can take on a few different forms. A candidate engagement campaign doesn't need to incorporate all of these tactics and activities. You should consider this a menu and not a checklist. We can go to the next slide. So first, there's the traditional candidate forum, which Jay introduced earlier. This is a moderated event hosted by an organization where candidates respond to questions related to that organization's work. Now, if you're interested in this but don't feel like your organization has the capacity to host a candidate forum, consider reaching out to another organization that is already hosting a nonpartisan candidate forum and seeing if they can ask a question about issues related to veteran homelessness. As an alternative, you could have candidates join a site visit where they could tour a facility and speak directly with program participants in a less structured setting. In some cases, it may make sense to attend an event organized by a campaign, like a town hall, rather than planning an event from scratch. If you do this, then you can submit a question in advance or ask a question from the audience at a town hall. This can be a more manageable way to get a candidate on the record than planning an entire forum, and this can still have a big impact. You're still getting them on the record. I talked about candidate questionnaires already. I'll note that we have a sample candidate questionnaire on our candidate engagement page. And again, if you don't have the capacity to design and conduct a candidate questionnaire, you can reach out to a partner organization that is conducting one. The League of Women Voters will sometimes do these as an example, and see if they can include a question about veteran homelessness. Media advocacy can also be a form of candidate engagement. Candidates do tend to read their local papers, so writing a letter to the editor or an op-ed about housing solutions can be a good way to get a candidate thinking about housing and homelessness. We also have a media toolkit with a sample op-ed that you can adapt, and we'll include that link in our follow-up email. We can go to the next slide. We also have some recommendations for planning effective nonpartisan candidate forums specifically, and I know that James will go into a little bit more detail on this. First, we always recommend having a moderator or a key planning role for people who have lived experience of homelessness or housing instability. This can be a really empowering opportunity for people who are most directly affected by our housing policies to engage with their decision makers, and for candidates to kind of have a face to the policies that we're talking about and recognize why they matter. Candidate forums, of course, should always be fully accessible to low-income community members and people with disabilities. What this means will, of course, vary depending on your community's needs, but it could mean hosting the event at an accessible time and location, offering food if it's during a mealtime so people don't need to plan around it, offering captioning or ASL interpretation, offering translation if many people in your community speak a language other than English. Of course, as always, ensuring the space is accessible, or perhaps offering a live streaming option or hosting the event virtually so that it's accessible for anyone who can't attend in person, and making sure that there's a mechanism for any online attendees to ask questions so they can participate equally. In terms of planning, you should set a date for the forum well in advance. This gives you plenty of time for robust and nonpartisan outreach to all candidates and to promote it to your community members. You should consider hosting the event with a coalition of organizations who share your mission. That will increase turnout and enable you to combine resources to cover any event expenses. And having multiple co-hosts may also incentivize the candidates to attend, since they know they'll be reaching a larger audience. You should ensure that there's good publicity for the event, issue a press release to invite the media, and let candidates know that media has been invited. During the event, you should live tweet or whatever other social media you use so that your followers can see the highlights, and then send a recap or recording out to your organization's email list. You'll want to curate the questions. Start with a few pre-prepared questions, and then have staff or volunteers distribute note cards to attendees when they arrive, or have some sort of app-based system for submitting questions. Then you can collect and sort through the questions during the event to pass along the most relevant and interesting ones to the moderators. You can also allow attendees to submit questions in advance if there's a registration form for the event. You'll want to give the candidates some time to share their own priorities. They're making time available during a very busy campaign season, so give them some time to discuss their vision and campaign on their own terms. And last but not least, use the event as a springboard for voter outreach. Have a voter registration table, so you can ensure that everyone who's attending to hear from the candidate is also registered to vote. And you'll want to collect all attendees' contact information, so then you can follow up with reminders about registration and voting. We can go to the next slide. That brings me to kind of my concluding slides, which is just a very quick run through of resources that Our Homes, Our Votes has available to support nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement work. You can go to the next slide. So I highly recommend checking out the Our Homes, Our Votes resource library at ourhomes-ourvotes.org. You'll find tips and template resources for planning pretty much every aspect of a nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement campaign. We also have a bi-weekly webinar series that provides deep dives into voter and candidate engagement for housing advocates, tenant leaders, and staff at direct service organizations. Our next webinar is coming up and is very topical for this group. It's next Monday, July 1st at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, and we'll cover the topic of voting while experiencing homelessness. You can find the dates and topics for the full webinar series and the registration link at ourhomes-ourvotes.org/webinars-2024. We can go to the next slide. We also have a new online voter registration and information tool called TurboVote. This is a one-stop shop where voters can register, check their registration status, sign up for election reminders, and find nonpartisan election information for their community. And this is really great. It's available in both English and Spanish. In addition to using this to perhaps check your own voter registration right here, right now, we also want this tool to be widely used and for our partners to incorporate it into their outreach. You can include this link or a QR code in emails or social media messages, on flyers and posters, or in any voter registration drives you're doing. And if you're hosting a candidate forum, you should project it on screen at the event or screen share it as people are coming in and out. So you're really making voter registration visible to anyone who's attending. If you want a custom TurboVote link so you can find out the total number of people who register through your outreach, or you just want to set up a time to talk about this tool and how you might be able to use it, feel free to reach out to me directly. We can set up a time to talk. We can go to the next slide. Our Homes, Our Votes also has a network of affiliates, which are nonpartisan organizations that are committed to carrying out the goals of this campaign. This is open to pretty much any nonpartisan organization, advocacy organizations, direct service providers, local governments, tenant associations, really anyone who shares this mission is welcome to become an affiliate. We have a listserv where we regularly share announcements and opportunities. We have regular office hours for our affiliates. We'll do a post-election virtual affiliates gathering to kind of unpack, and we have enhanced access to some Our Homes, Our Votes tools and resources. You can sign up at ourhomes-ourvotes.org/affiliates, and we can go to the next slide, which I believe is the final slide. I also encourage you to celebrate voter participation with some of our new Our Homes, Our Votes swag. You can visit nlihc.myshopify.com for an expanded collection of Our Homes, Our Votes apparel, accessories, stickers, buttons, and more. My personal favorite highlight of the collection are our brand new TurboVote magnets, which actually have that QR code to TurboVote and direct voters to register in this really eye-grabbing and fun way. All of the swag is available in both English and Spanish, and if you're like, yes, I want a ton of this stuff to distribute, you can send me an email and we can set up a bulk order for you to get some really major discounts. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I think my email address is on the final slide, and I will then turn it back over to Jay. I think we're doing questions at the very end. Also, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Thank you, Courtney, for that presentation. Moving on, we next have James. James, like Courtney mentioned, will go over more into detail over how the candidate forum will look, planning it out, and logistics you should know. Take it away, James. Oh, and don't forget to use the questions if you have a question.
Thank you, Jay, and thanks, Courtney, for that very detailed presentation that I believe accompanies or partners with mine very well, because I would like to talk about organizing a candidate forum, but including some planning details around communications that I think are fairly simple, but very, very, very important, have a lasting impact or very deep impact on the planning process and the logistics process that we kind of tend to forget because if you have been in nonprofit as long as I have, I know that a lot of us get so deep into the weeds and the work that we're doing the work and we're trying to get things done, and we forget um, about the planning piece and the communications and marketing piece to help make sure that all of that hard work does not go to waste. So we can go to the next slide, and I can tell you more about what I'm saying. So consider your logistics. So I think, like I was saying, we in the nonprofit world, it moves a mile a minute. We have lots of goals that we're trying to reach. We have lots of audiences that we're engaging, and we're a lot of times focusing on production and productivity. And we don't tend to leave a lot of lead time for things like this. So I want to stress the importance of considering your logistics. And I think the very first thing is that when your team, I know at Miriam's Kitchen, we have a wonderful advocacy team who we partner with, as they are the leaders of a lot of that kind of work, but we partner with them. And the first thing that we always do, as soon as they realize that they want to do an event this way, they immediately pull us in, because our jobs as communicators and marketers are to probe. We probe you and to make sure that you have thought about how we're going to leverage the event, who is supposed to be in the room, and all of those good things. So, in considering your logistics, as I was alluding to, timing is key. Build in time to not just plan the event, but market the event. You can't you can't properly market an event or candidate forum that you just decided that you wanted to do 3 weeks ago. So make sure that you are taking things like that into consideration, because you don't want to put forth all this effort uh, only to shoot yourself in the foot because you didn't have time to market the event, do media, or even invite the candidates, all of the candidates that need to be there. Choose a day and time that is most likely convenient for your audience, whoever your audience is for whatever the event is, even if it's not a candidate forum. Make sure that you think about who you're speaking to, and you kind of have to put yourself in the role of you kind of have to use some psychology, is what I'm saying. You have to use a little bit of psychology and think about what time of day, what day of week, what time of the year is going to best suit you and help you reach your goal. What environment will benefit your audience in that moment? Of course, we experienced the foolishness of 2020 and beyond, where we were doing things virtually. Um, so now that we are further away from that, you have to ask yourself, well, is this an opportunity to bring people into the room so that we can have some face-to-face discussions and have some photo ops, or is this the kind of event that should be virtual? Should it include an internal audience, or should it include an external audience that is inclusive of everyone? You have to ask yourself all of those kind of things. You have to get down to the nitty gritty, so that your event and your discussions are tailored and custom for the folks you're trying to reach. And also, always, because again, many of us are in nonprofit organizations, if not all of us here. So you have to consider and leverage your resources. What are some ways you can skip out on the budget? Like, do you have a partner who is willing to give you or provide you space for the event? Do you have partners that will be willing to sponsor your event if you choose to have it in person, or if you need a certain resource for it, any kind of thing like that? Consider all of the things that you have at your disposal in the very beginning, because there is likely the chance that somewhere in there you have some partnerships that are just waiting for you take advantage of. We can go to the next slide. So, okay, you've decided you wanted to do a candidate forum. You've probed, you've asked questions, you've answered questions, you've thought about all of the timing and all of the calendar items. Now it's time to plan your content, which is the meat of the whole thing. So, um, one of the very first things that we do when we're planning things like this is that we make sure that our focus is narrowed. Like I said, we make sure that our content is customized for those who are trying to reach. So consider the goal of your candidate forum or your event and work toward that specific goal, or goals if you have more than one, but work towards those and avoid hosting an event that does not support your mission, your clients, or your internal and external partnerships. A lot of times, I've also seen that we get trapped into producing these events just for the sake of producing an event and being seen and checking off a list. But and to it's easy to not be intentional. And so we want to make sure that we're intentional. We want to make sure our focus is narrow, and we want to make sure that we have um, very clear returns on the event in the end. Did we want to get new email subscribers? Did we want to bring attention to our website? Did we want media coverage? Did we want new partnerships? Did we want donations? You should be able to quickly look at the numbers or the things produced from the event afterwards, and tell whether or not it's something that was assessed and something that you want to do again. Um, Develop non-biased, open-ended themes and conversations that highlight the candidate's ability or lack thereof to support your work and those who benefit from it. Um, I say so. This is a bit of a journalism tip that I learned in school while I was training in the industry, and that is to you get a lot more out of people when you're talking to them or interviewing them or just engaging them. You get a lot more out of them if you ask them open-ended, probing questions instead of trying to lead them to an answer that you want. I can ask you, um, well, what kind of water is that you're drinking? Instead of asking, well, what are some of the what makes you want to walk around with that water that you have in your hand? Not the best example, but you get what I'm saying. Open-ended questions are always going to elicit more of a response. It'll get people talking. It'll probably get them saying more than what they intended to say. And this is what you want. You want people to shell out that information, especially when you're talking about a candidate forum. You want to know as much as you can about what they plan to do for your constituent base and your members or your clients or guests that we call them at Miriam's Kitchen, folks that we serve. You want to know what they plan to do. So develop non-biased, open-ended themes and conversations so that you can get the most out of your event. Next slide, please. So you've done the logistics, you've planned your content and your discussion. Now you have to build the panel and make sure there are people there to have the conversation with. Again, leverage your resources. Use your network to potentially connect you to candidates faster. And I say that because that will give you more time for marketing and media pitching. And I understand that sometimes there are not those kind of connections that we can benefit from. Which is why when you have to do cold calls and emails, excuse me, when you have to do cold calls and emails, that makes timing even more of the essence. It makes it even more important for you to make sure that you are planning this event out well ahead of time. You factor in that time to reach out to candidates who are very busy, and giving consideration to you and your team, who I'm sure are very busy. And it makes it more possible for you to get everyone in the room that you need there, and for you to make sure that you have reached out to everybody that you need to in order to be there to witness the event. Also, be strategic about choosing a moderator. This is very important because you don't want someone, first of all, you don't want to not have a moderator. That's number one. And number two, you don't want a moderator who is not prepared to come into the space and control the space. Um, so who is in your organization or your network that has a firm control of the subject matter, who can best guide the conversation, and who might even be able to attract more attendees? Who do you know who has a larger following that can get people in the room and get people interested in the event? And one of the last things I'll say here about building the panel is to be inclusive. And I think Courtney covered this during her presentation. You want to make sure that you give everyone the opportunity to speak. Don't plan a forum around who your favorites are, because that again will you will run the risk of endorsing candidates or excluding candidates. And so you need to look at this as an opportunity to have a respectful debate and conversation. Um, because again, these are moments to educate folks, not just your audience or your clients or your guests. This is an opportunity to educate these candidates too, so that in the event that whoever gets in office that you didn't maybe necessarily want there, you've had the opportunity to educate them and probably change some of the thoughts that they've had around your cause or your issue. So look at this as an opportunity. Do not shy away from inviting candidates who may not necessarily share your views. Next slide, please. So you've built your panel, you've done the logistics, you've done all of the pre-planning work. Now it's time for you to build a run of show. Um, so as a communicator, as an event planner, you know, I always say that the key to any event is to leave very little room for error. Plan the event down to the minute, because your panelists and your audience and your team will thank you for a smooth and predictable event. Remember, this is not reality television, so surprises and off the rail moments are not welcome here. This is not the space for that. We want to be able to predict every single thing that is going to happen. Maybe not every single comment, but we want to be able to predict what we're going to get out of an event that we go there when we go there. And then also plot times for remarks, limit times for each discussion. This is what I was talking about when I was saying choose a good moderator. You want to make sure that your moderator is up for the task of helping to manage and enforce these time marks and these rules in the conversation. You want to make sure that they are up to that challenge of controlling that environment in the moment, keeping you on track. Next slide, please. So you've done all that, and you're getting closer and closer to the finish line. Now it's time for you to plan a pre-form meeting. So you're gonna want to gather your panelists for a run through of the forum, but you also want to show respect for their time by making this a brief call or virtual meeting ahead of the event. Ensure your panelists have all the pertinent day of logistics they'll need, whether it's access to get into the virtual meeting space, or whether it's directions to the facility, parking instructions, whatever they need in that day to make sure that them getting to your event, participating in your event is as smooth as possible. You want to lay all that out to them ahead of time so that they're able to easily participate, so that the door is open for you to collaborate once again in the future. Also, again, consider schedules of the folks who are involved, especially the candidates in a candidate forum. Consider their very busy schedules. So, in that, you extend the courtesy of having their assistants or a colleague who works closely with them attend this particular pre-form meeting so that they can relay all the important information back to the candidate. Um, this is pretty common. And during election season, as you know, they are probably attending many forums like yours. So, just remember to extend that courtesy so that you can consider their schedule while also making sure they have the information that they need. Next slide. Okay, so you've planned the entire thing. So this is another comms moment here. Make sure you capture the moment. The event does not end just because you've gotten the planning doesn't end just because you've gotten your space and your panelists in order. It's not You're not done yet. Have you pitched media? Have you identified ways to document the event through photo or video? Because again, the event itself isn't over just because it's over, if you get what I'm saying. You should be leveraging um, whatever event you're producing. You should be leveraging that as content later. It's going to help with your messaging. It's going to help with your digital metrics. It's going to help with your PR. It's going to help with your advocacy, all of that. So be thinking about how you're going to document your event. Be thinking about uh, things like, are you going to live stream it or um, live post? These can actually vary based on goals, but more times than not, you're going to want to do these things or at least consider doing these things based on whatever the goals are that you have set for your particular organization, your team, and uh, your goals and your outcomes that you want. Um, and again, the event isn't over just because the event day has passed. Create post-event coverage in email, on social media, on your website, and etc., so that you can share not just with the panelists afterwards, because I'm sure they're going to need the content, but you also want your members of your wider network to be able to go back and look at the work that you've done and all of the ways that you've advocated for the cause and for your clients and your guests. Um, you're going to want those things. So remember that because, again, sometimes it's easy to forget such things because we are trying to be superheroes in our respective areas. I believe that might be it. I think the last slide is a contact slide so that you can reach out to me if you have any questions. Yes, it is. My email's there. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions that we aren't able to get to today.
Great. Thank you, James, for that wonderful presentation. So we have 6 minutes left, so we're going to move on to Q&A. So if I can have both my presenters on camera for this part of the session. So first question is, let's see here, what are the most successful outcomes you've seen from local nonpartisan engagement? No, that could be that's for either one of you. Whoever wants to take up the question. Yeah.
I can take one. I just have an example from a group of tenant leaders in Minnesota that have been like super engaged with candidates during the election, and they come to our conference every year, and they participate in our Capitol Hill Day, and they've you know they've engaged in the about their priorities in the election cycle and actually gotten their elected officials to stand up for those priorities in terms of repairs in their buildings and getting that funding. So then they come to DC, they thank the they thank their members of Congress and they push them on the next thing. So they really have that kind of cycle of engagement during the election season and during the candidates' time in office.
Yeah, and I think a couple of the things that I've seen that are really cool and beneficial is that from that kind of engagement, you have people partnering with organizations to write bills, to help further their work, and you have partnerships that are built, um, to where the particular candidate, is continuously championing your cause. And so those are two really good things that I've seen come out of it.
Next question is, how do you explain to candidates why they should come to your forum?
I'll say from a comms perspective, doing in well, maybe any perspective, but uh researching their weaknesses and giving them and letting them know you're giving them an opportunity to change the narrative around, wherever their weakest campaign point is. Kind of exploit those weaknesses and let them know that you're giving them an opportunity to kind of to level the waters there, and be upfront with them about who the audience is, because you might have a particular audience that um, they don't readily have access to, in other at other times or in other spaces.
Yeah, I'd make the same point about the audience. Just, candidates want to be in front of as many people as possible. And if they feel that you have a strong audience that they might not otherwise get their message to, it's pretty compelling to have that space.
Next question we have here is, how do you guys think these events help people with lived experience feel heard and grow into advocates? And what particular support should providers implement to ensure that they have a great and useful experience?
I think that, there's often the sentiment of, well, my elected officials don't care about me. Why should I vote? But then when you have the people in front of you that are, potentially your future elected officials, and you hear them talking about the issues affecting your life, whether in good or bad ways, it really makes concrete the consequences of the election. And it goes the other way as well, where if you have a candidate that's engaging with tenant leaders or people experiencing homelessness, then that population that's affected by policies becomes more concrete and they may have more incentive to prioritize those communities. And I think what providers can do is make sure that people who are attending can actually get their questions heard, whether they have submitted those questions in advance or have the opportunity to submit them during the event. Like, make sure the questions that get asked are aligned with what community members want to hear answered. And the more that people can feel like their question got asked, the more empowered they'll feel.
I don't have anything else to go along with that. Courtney hit the nail on the head, because I've seen so many times where, again, we're so passionate as leaders in this work that we have these events and we spend all much of the time talking. So make sure that you build in not just time for people to ask questions, but make sure that you build in those mechanisms on the front end for people to get the questions in ahead of time so that you can build it into your content.
Great, thank you all. That concludes Q&A. Again, I want to thank our presenters for that wonderful webinar session. Again, I do want to say that we are releasing these webinars on a monthly schedule, so be on the lookout for the next webinar we have coming up, which is focused on empowering homeless voters from disenfranchisement. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you have a colleague that missed today's live session, or you would like to review what we discussed at your own pace, please go ahead and visit NCHV or the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans on YouTube. Also, just be sure to visit some of our online resources. have a plethora of things to peruse at nchv.org. You can also listen in on our podcast, The Road Home, which is on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So again, I just want to give another huge thanks. That was a wonderful presentation altogether from our panelists, and of course, a huge thanks to the Home Depot Foundation for making this project possible. One last, folks who are attending or who have attended today's session, and I look forward to seeing you all in a month. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all.